There we are. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Office Document and Accessibility, presented by the IT Accessibility Initiative of MD-TAP. We're just going to cover the usual housekeeping items. We have captioning available today, so you can turn that on using the closed caption button on your menu ribbon. We also have an ASL interpreter today, so anyone who wishes to use that service, they should be spotlighted for you. Once we get rolling, I will turn off my video as well just to make sure it's not interfering. So if there is a technical issue with that, if for whatever reason you cannot see the interpreter, please let us know. Message the hosts, and we will try to solve that as soon as we are able to. This meeting is being recorded, so that recording will be shared after probably a day or two once it processes, as long as the slide deck and the test document that I'll be showing you guys later, those will be sent out in an email, hopefully on Friday. If not, it'll be early next week. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to turn off my video. There we are. Oh, one thing before I forget, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in either chat or Q&A. Chat's probably a bit better so that everyone can see it, but we want to make sure that we are trying to minimize distractions for people. So if you can, please hold your questions to the end, and I will try to answer them then. I'll make sure to set aside 5 to 10 minutes to do so. So to start today, I would like to first discuss what makes a document accessible. What are the principles that you need to follow and think about when you're starting to write a document? I do want to say that these kinds of things should become natural to you. Once you get a little bit of practice with them and using the tools, it should be just as easy as creating a document in any other format. You really just need to making sure that you're using the tools the program gives you that help create the functionality that a person who is blind or low vision needs in order to read the differences between headings and paragraphs, or for someone who's colorblind and they're able to differentiate a link from regular text, or making sure that if someone is using a customized control scheme, such as using Dragon voice control software, that links and text and forms are able to work with their software. So the first one is headings and structure. So making sure that we have very clear distinction of our headings and that they function as headings, that we have an intended reading order, so making sure you set up your document so that it reads the way you intend a user to read it to assistive technology. Alternative text, so making sure any images, tables, forms, infographics, anything like that has alternative text that communicates to someone who can't see that image. Meaningful link text, so making sure that we're not just giving people a URL that might have a lot of extra characters or extra, or making it too long, apologies, so that a person can understand where that link will go when they click it. And then tables and data relations, making sure that we set up our tables in a way that communicates that information to users so they don't have to try and maintain those relationships themselves in their head. And then finally, we'll briefly touch on forms and labels, really just going over the basics of it, what you need in order to communicate information to users on how to complete that form. I won't go into too much detail about forms because we do an entire presentation on forms and labels. We just did that a couple months ago, and you can view the recording on our YouTube channel. If you do have questions about that, though, please feel free to reach out. Always happy to try and explain things in more depth to people. So going into a bit more detail about each of these principles. First one, heading and structure. So headings provide a method for finding content quickly. For most users, when you bold text and make it larger, our eyes are drawn to it and we naturally think, okay, everything following this is going to touch on this topic. But one of the important things is that we need to add that functionality so it communicates that same intention to assistive technology. That's why we need to make sure we use styles and presets, because that adds that functionality without you having to figure out how do you add that in the back end, or code it or whatever. You don't have to do that. Word, Office, Excel, all of that does it for you. You just need to make sure that you're using the style. Doing so makes the heading both look like a heading, but then also adds that back-end functionality, so that when a screen reader reads that heading, it tells the user this is a heading. We also want to make sure that we're using those headings to signify the relationship between content. So uh, generally, you want to think of it as an outline. So heading 2 starts a subject, and then subsets underneath theirs are called a heading 3. The start of your document will probably be a heading 1. That's generally considered best practice. And when I get into the demonstration part, I'll go into more depth about how this would look and how this would be communicated to users. Generally, the best way to handle this is follow a template. When you are creating a completely unique layout, you might have to put some extra thought towards accessibility on how you're setting it up, how you intend readers to move through it, what they might be looking for, and how can they get to it quickly and easily. Templates already have that kind of built in, so it generally takes a little bit less effort to just fill in the details and let the system take care of those challenges for you. Once you get used to using the template or seeing how it's laid out, then you can start applying those same principles to your actual documents when you're setting them up. Now, intended reading order. The structure helps determine this, and the language that you put it into also determines kind of how you would read it. For English, that's left to right, top to bottom. Depending on if you are writing in another language for whatever reason, if you're sending this to a constituent who uses another primary language, then you would need to determine how they intend to read it. You also need to make sure that any layout changes you make are going to affect reading order. In a standard document, that's usually never a problem. However, if you start using more than a single column, if you start setting up 2 columns, if you start moving around images to interrupt paragraphs, those will affect the reading order, and you need to think about how that's going to affect the meaning that you are communicating to your users. So images that are separated from text may not be read in the intended order. So a lot of the times people like to make the images floating, because that lets you control where exactly on the page they're going to be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that even though visually you see that image floating to the right of a paragraph, the screen reader is going to find that image there. In some cases, it might move it to the top of the document because it's reading per what are called layers. It might move it to the bottom of the document. It might be right in the middle of that paragraph, and your alternative text or your unlabeled graphic is now interrupting your paragraph, and the user's going to be like, what was that? So we need to make sure that when we put images in, we also know where they're going to be read. Generally, making it flow with text makes this a lot easier to do. One tip that you should know is that PowerPoint's a bit different than Word and Excel and such. Its reading order is found in the Arrange button and the Selection pane. I'll show you guys that later, but it's on the Home ribbon. And then it lists it depending on what version you're using. It might read it starting at the bottom, not the top of the list. PowerPoint does warn you of this, especially the older versions. The latest version has actually fixed it. So 365, if you're on the latest patch, has it set up correctly, or well, not correctly, but more intuitively, where it lists it from the top to the bottom as you would expect. You do need to get a bit creative with it though, because that arrangement will also affect visual order. So if you have overlapping elements, it might interfere with that. And so you might need to get a little creative with either how you're spacing things or with how you intend users to read it. We'll go into a bit more detail during the demonstration. Now, alternative text. Here are some general rules on how to cover this. I did have a presentation a few months ago on writing good alternative text, so I'll make sure that you all have the link to that later on when I send out that email. But here are your general rules for starting out. First is be accurate and concise. You don't want to add interpretation. Your goal is really just tell the user what is the image conveying. You want to limit your description to a few words, to a few sentences, or maybe even just a single sentence if needed. The more description you add, the longer a user has to sit there and listen to it. And especially if it's going into a lot of detail that's not relevant to what the image's purpose is or what your discussion is, then it's just creating clutter. And then finally, we want to avoid redundancy. If the image description is just going to give us the same text that's already in the paragraph nearby, or if it's not adding anything else to the conversation, then we're going to treat it as a decorative image. So if possible, we want to mark those sorts of images as decorative. If you have 365, you do have the option to mark it as such. There's a little checkbox in the alternative text menu that lets you click that, and then screen readers are going to ignore the image. If you don't have that, if you're using an older version of Word or another Office product, then you'll just write decorative into the alt text, because then at least that communicates to the user the same thing and they can manually skip it. Jumping back, we want to make sure that we never use image of or picture of. The reason for that is because we want to avoid redundancy. The screen reader or other assistive technology like voice control software will tell users this is a graphic, or this is a button, or this is a heading. So we don't need to tell users that. Their software, we can lean on that to do that for us. So we really just want to make sure we're giving them the very pertinent information. One caveat to all of this is that images that are acting as links should instead state the link destination instead of giving a description of the image. The reason for that is because, again, we want users to understand what's going to happen when they click that link, where they're going to go. And so a screen reader is going to read the description of the image for that information rather than anything else, like the URL. So that's why we need to put our link description in the alt text instead of a description of the image. If we try to do both, then we get into, again, that issue of clutter and giving people too much information, having to sift through it in order to find what they're looking for. Adding on to the meaningful links, link text should denote the destination. We want people, especially in this day and age, to be very, to have a very good understanding of what's going to happen when they click that link. In some cases, we might need to tell them if this is going to open in a certain window or something like that. We don't typically need to do that in documents because generally it's assumed that you click a link in a document, it's going to open your browser or open your email if you're clicking a link to a person's email address. But we want to make sure that we're at least giving them a good sample of where they're going. So usually the title of a website, or if it's an email address and you format it as an email address, that's very clear to people. URLs aren't always clear, especially when they're read by assistive technology. The longer a URL is, so if you're going to a specific page inside a website rather than just a home page, it might have a long URL following it, especially if it's something like a search result or it's a registration page, where you're going to have this long string of characters and numbers after the initial URL, like zoom.us/, and then it just has a string of unintelligible language that's really just there. So that's why we need to tell people this is the registration for today's webinar. Much clearer, tells people what's going to happen when they click that link. They know where they're going, and they don't have to worry about going to something unknown or potentially something even worse. As I said, email addresses are acceptable as is. General convention, we all know how email addresses are written out. So as long as it reads like that, users are going to understand what that is. The only caveat to that might be is if it's a rather unique email or a different host, but you can use your best judgment regarding that. As I said, page title or phrase is usually sufficient. One thing to avoid, though, is using something like click here or a single word. The reason for that is because click here, especially if you're using this multiple times, is now uh, creating potential confusion for a user who's looking through. Maybe they're looking for a specific link, or because the screen reader is going to stop here on click here, read that as just a link, and then they have to read surrounding information for context. Or if someone is using voice control software again, and they say, click the click here link, and there's 4 of them on a page, the voice control software doesn't know which one to click. So we need to make sure that the link is unique. Um, Single word, kind of the same reason, but then we also are making sure that we're providing a larger target. If this document is being opened up on, say, a tablet or on their phone, it's a lot harder to press that link if it's a single word, especially if it's a short word, versus something like a longer phrase, like register for today's webinar. A much longer phrase provides a lot more information when they read just the link text, and then also gives a larger target for someone who's maybe using a touchscreen. As I mentioned again on the previous slide, image links should use alt text to inform AT users of what's going on. So again, that alt text kind of trumps anything else that is being used for a description. So that's why we use that for the image or for the link description rather than the image description. And then finally, make sure your links are visually distinguishable from regular text. Do not use color as the only method. It's becoming a bit of a trend to just use color to denote a link from regular text, especially on websites. But that can be a problem when either a user has maybe a color filter on their computer set up, especially if they're colorblind, or if they have low vision and they're using magnification and they're not able to distinguish it, the link properly. So we need to make sure that we use something like an underline or maybe italics. The default underline is really the best method, so there really isn't a reason to turn that off. But if for whatever reason you do that, make sure that you're doing something else to make it visible to users aside from color. Now, tables and data. This can be a bit of a challenge initially because while tables are very useful, a lot of times they get used in the wrong way. So first thing I want to say is don't use tables for formatting. The reason for this is because it changes behaviors for assistive technology users, AT users. A screen reader is going to change how it moves because a user, instead of using maybe tab or the down arrow in order to read a paragraph, now they have to use all 4 arrows in order to move from cell to cell. And they might not read it in the order you intend them to, or you might have to be adding a lot of other instruction to tell them where to go. Uh, Something like voice control software, if you're setting up a form in a table, they're going to have to start navigating it by cell. They might have to guess which cell it is if you're hiding rows or you're adding extra rows or columns to create space, that kind of thing. So we need to make sure that if we do that, that we are setting up as simply as possible. Now, if you're using a table to share data, then there are a couple things that you should be doing to make it a better experience for your users. First is to add a heading row and then a first column if that's applicable to your data. So the reason for this is that by doing so, it maintains the relationship between data so users don't have to backtrack. So if you set up a table, you have a header row at the top, and your left column, your first column, has more instructions for that area. When a user is in, say, cell D5, when they read that cell, it will read the heading for column D and then row 5, and then the data in that cell so that users get the whole picture of what that cell represents, rather than going to that cell and then having to go back up top to make sure they're in the correct column, come back down, and go back to the left column, or to make sure they're in the right row. It just does it for them. So it makes it a lot easier to get the same information faster. Makes it a more efficient, more enjoyable experience. Again, we want to make sure that color is not our only conveying method. This is especially important in things like infographics and charts. We want to make sure that we're adding symbols or formatting to help connect data and categories, make it easier for users, especially if you're showing a large amount of data being compared, that you're giving people a way to differentiate them if they're colorblind, especially if you're using like red, green, or blue, yellow, the two most common forms of color blindness. Um, Charts are difficult. There's a lot of work going on to try and make them as accessible as possible, but they still aren't really there without either proprietary software or experiments, or kind of simplifying it to the point where it might not be as useful as just a table. So I would recommend, if possible, use a table instead, or if you're going to use a chart, that you have an alternative available elsewhere that you can link to tell people, here's a way to get the same information in a more accessible manner. If you do use a chart, there are a couple things we can do to try and make them readable. Generally, making sure, again, that you label everything properly. If you're going to convert this to a PDF, there is a way to set it up in PDFs to be able to read it in something of a understandable order. I go into more detail on that in another webinar. It's called Accessible Graphic Design. Again, we have a couple recordings of that available, but if you have questions, please reach out. But as I said, this is where you have to start considering an alternative method that's more accessible, and providing that either in the same document or elsewhere. All right, now finally, forms and labels. So when you create a form field and you open its properties, there will be a name and a help text, or it might be like name and tooltip, anything like that. AT uses those names and help text to label form fields. So when a screen reader finds a form field, it reads the name. When you're inside of it and you press the help button, or the tooltip, read that, it's going to read that form. So you want to make sure that both of those provide the same description. Voice control will also use that in order to identify a form field, to let a user go to that specific form field. So very important that we provide those names in both a visible manner and then in the properties of that form field. It only takes a couple seconds to do, so not really anything extra on your end, but it does make a world of difference for someone trying to use your form. When you're setting the layout for your form, make sure that you're giving enough space that visible labels are easily related to fields. So I know a lot of us, when they set up forms, we kind of expect it to be either right to the left of a form field or right above it, but making sure that you're not trying to cram as many as possible into the page makes a lot easier for a user to have just a little bit of white space in between form fields to be able to distinguish which one is the next one. It also helps you, as you're creating your form, make sure to keep those relationships together and make it easier to possibly either tag it if you're going to move to PDF, or just to make sure that when you're trying to edit it or change properties, you're not misclicking the wrong one or trying to jam in more information where you can't fit it. So it might make your document a bit longer, but it makes it a lot easier. So keep that in mind. Again, if you're setting up a different layout, I know a lot of the times with form fields, we like to make multiple columns, or if you have like a radio button where you're choosing yes, no, or one of 5 options, or you're saying check one of the following, and there's like 15 items there, that kind of setup can change your reading order. So double check that once you've completed it. Make sure that your mouse cursor, or rather your reading cursor, moves through them in the way you want a user to move through it. Again, re-emphasizing, we want to avoid using tables for formatting because that does change the behavior, especially inside a form. And the problem with documents and tables is that we don't have a way here to use the table for formatting while making it not readable to AT. We can do that in HTML, which is why HTML is honestly the best method for creating a form, but uh, sometimes we need to send an individual document to someone. So we just want to make sure that we avoid using tables for formatting. There is a lot you can do though with just the basic formatting. So keep that in mind, is that if you can mess with margins or spacing, you can generally create a very pleasing aesthetic without resorting to using a table. The final thing when you're creating a form is don't lock your editing privileges. The problem with that is that if you do, it actually blocks AT. So screen readers, voice control software, magnifiers can't read the document, especially the surrounding text, like your instructions or something, because the cursor can't get to it, can't copy paste information and read it out. So if you have to do that for security reasons or whatever, you might have to create instruction fields that are form fields that are read-only, that have either the instructions or maybe due to character limit, you have to might break it up into multiple fields that a user can get to if you lock the file. Um, because Word has the ability to make it so you can only edit form fields, and at least that way a user can still get the information they need, such as instructions or uh, information on where to send the form after it's completed, that kind of thing, without being denied it because the security privileges only let them interact with form fields. All right, so now let's get into the demonstration portion. So I have a Word document up here on screen, and we're just going to quickly walk through the different formatting things you can do and all of the setups that are communicated. So on your home ribbon, we're going to talk about heading and structure first. On your home ribbon, you might have a larger box on here that shows individual ones, but it's the styles button. If you have the collapsed ribbon, on here, you can see here's all the various different default styles Word gives you. So we have title. So this initial line here is a title. What it's done is just, as you can see, it's 28 font, a lot larger. It has a headings font instead of body font. But title doesn't actually communicate anything to users. But title is generally used in more formal documents, thesis paper, official report, that kind of thing. You're unlikely to be using that. Just be aware that if you do use it, it's not going to communicate anything to the users like headings. So you might need to put like a subheading underneath it that acts as a heading for users. Now, headings, as I mentioned, are broken into different levels. So there's heading 1, there's heading 2, there's heading 3. Let me hide my floating controls so they're not in my way. Here we go. Apologies for that. So easiest way for me to explain this to people is if I go to View, and on the middle of the ribbon, there's the Show group, and then there's the Navigation pane, which is the third option in it. If I open that, a new panel on the left opens. That's the Navigation pane. The first one it gives us is Headings. And this is where you can see the structure of your document. A very great way to visualize it so that you understand how your information is broken up. But the second thing is that by using the styles we were talking about and it adds it into this list, I, as a mouse user, can click this and immediately jump to the 2-column layout demonstration. I can go back to the heading 1 format, click that, I jump back up there. Screen reader users can do this without even using the navigation pane. There's a shortcut key they can press to move through all the headings, or they can move it through individual levels, heading 2, heading 3. Voice control users can also do the same thing. So they're able to say jump to heading and it will jump to the next heading. And so this gives users a great way to move around the document quickly. Helps everyone, uh, not just those with using assistive technology. So this is the reason that we want to use the presets, because if we just bold our text and make it larger or whatever, it looks like a heading, but it doesn't show up on this list. It doesn't give us that functionality that really makes the experience better for users. Now, if you notice, this one is a different color. It's bolded. It's very different from the default heading one, which is a blue text that is not bolded. You can create your own styles. So you can make your heading, just type it in, make it a heading one, and then I can go ahead and change this. I can make it bold. I can make it red. I can make it 20-point font. And then in the style menu, I can go to create a style. And this lets me save it. Now, initially, it'll just give you the name and what it looks like. But if I click modify, this is the menu you want, because here I can say, this is the name, or what I should call it. So I can say, this is, new heading one. Oops. Now, what this does is just the style type just controls what it affects. So we generally just leave that as paragraph and character. But based on is where it assigns that functionality we've been talking about. So I can make this act as a heading one. I can make it act as a heading two. I can make it act as a normal paragraph. I can make it act as a title. There's up-teen number of options here. Many of these are used in a lot more complex documents than we would talk about today, but you have a lot of options here for making something behave how you want it to. So for now, we'll make this heading one. The next one, style for following paragraph, is if you press enter after typing in text here, it will change it to the style for the next paragraph. So in this case, after writing in a heading one, I just want to make the next thing a paragraph. So I'll change this to normal. I can again change the formatting how I want here. And then I can say add to styles gallery so that I can use this in any future document. So those of you working for the state and you're creating documents to send out to the public, you have a particular set of guidelines you follow or a particular style that you make, you can go ahead and create that style and save it to your gallery. And then you don't have to do it again. You can just go back into your styles menu. It'll be listed here and you just click it, sets your style for that paragraph, and you're good to go. So and then finally, keep in mind that if you want to save it for other things, you need to do new documents based on this template. If you do only in this document, it only saves the format style for that document. So make sure that if you're going to use it for other things, you switch it to be available to all of your new documents. So that's how we create the formats and behaviors we want. Again, we want to make sure that we're breaking it up into an understandable manner. So we have heading one to start our document, and then heading two is kind of our major content blocks. They give us, maybe a particular amount of information. And then potentially you might have like subsets inside that. Like if you have for MD TAP, we would have the heading two, talk about the general program. And then underneath that would probably be a set of heading threes for each individual program, such as the loan program or the financial loan program or us as the IT accessibility initiative. Each of those would be a heading three underneath the MB tab. And then we might have another heading two that is for the rest of the Department of Disabilities. So that's how you can kind of imagine that information being broken up. You do have more headings down there, 4, 5, and 6. Word actually goes even further than that, but most other things such as PDFs or HTML only go up to 6. Generally, I don't think you would ever go past 3 unless you have like a formal like annual report that's going into 200 some pages. You might need all 6 headings then. Um, as I mentioned, best practice is to have a single H1 start your document or heading one. If you have one of those larger reports that's really broken up into like major sections, you might have multiple H1s then, that's fine. But for anything smaller than that, you really only want to use one. Okay, now adding alternative text. So when we click an image that we've put into our document, a couple ways you can get to this. On your menu ribbon, when you have an image selected, picture format will show up on the options, the menu options up at the top. We can click that. In 365, there is now a big button after your picture layout or picture styles that gives us the ability to add alt text. In other formats of Office, or even here, we can instead open the context menu, and there will be a view alt text or add alt text option here as well. Either way, it will open a new panel on the right where we have alt text here, and we can describe our image here. In this case, since this is just our logo, we just have empty tab logo as the description. We don't go into description of the logo itself because that's really not pertinent to the user. What we're really just trying to tell them is that this is our logo. This is denoting that this is an official thing from our department. 365 does have automated alt text for you. It's not that great, just to be perfectly candid. Um, it it can be very simple. If you have something like a screenshot that you're sharing, it's just going to tell you this is a screenshot. So generally, I would not rely on this. I wouldn't rely on it for honestly anything, even if you're using something like Facebook, which also has that capacity, or Google also has that capacity, but it is better than nothing. So if for whatever reason you get an image from someone else providing content and they don't give you a description and you're having trouble generating one, you can try it. I just warn you that it's not going to be great. Generally, it's just better to write in your own alt text. Now, as I mentioned, here is your option to mark something as decorative. By doing so, when a user is reading the document, it's instead going to skip that image. So anything that we don't want users to have to move through because it's really just adding, it's either redundant or it's adding like a visual organization. So I created this decorative line here, which is really just a box. I have decorative line in the alt text because older versions of Word don't have this option, but since we do have it here, I can click mark as decorative, and our alt text box grays out. It doesn't give us the option anymore, but when a screen reader moves through this document in browse mode, it'll skip it and it'll move directly from the logo to the following heading. That way, a user who's using a screen reader doesn't have to move through any of your descriptive lines or like images that are filling space, that kind of thing. It just makes it, again, a more pleasant experience rather than having to click or press like the down arrow 4 times to get down through this. They can press it 2 or even once just to move past anything that isn't useful to them. Now with tables, when we have a table up, we have our table layout here. Actually, it might be design. Sorry, it's table design. So again, like pictures, new options will become available in your menu ribbons when you're selected it. In your table design, here's where you can select header row and first column. Pretty much always, if you have data, you're going to need a header row. First column, if you're showing like comparisons or multiple things, that's where that's useful. But depending on your data and its relevancy, you might not use a first column, or you might have a last column or a total row or whatever. Just keep in mind what you're using and what it's going to help with. So in this case, because we have a header row and a first column, if we move down to this $100 here in column 3, row 3. The screen reader, when it finds that, it gets to it, is going to read $100 payment given amount. It does that all in one go so that a user doesn't have to find the $100 and then go back up to make sure that they're in the payment given column, come back down, go back to the left in order to make sure that they're in the amount row. It just makes it a single experience, makes it a lot easier for users to get the information they need in a relevant manner, and not have to make guesses based on their detective work. One other thing with tables, if we go to the context menu and go to table properties, we also want to make sure in the first tab is table, the second one is row. If we click row, the third checkbox on here is repeat as header row at the top of each page. We want to make sure that that is checked, because if for whatever reason your table goes across multiple pages, without that, you will need to either create a whole new table or it won't communicate the header on the next page. So by doing this, we're making sure that we keep the behavior we want for users. There is an alt text for tables. Generally, it's not terribly important for you to do this, because usually you're going to have something before the table telling us what it is, but it can be helpful. So I would recommend that you do go to this and at least add the title. You might not need to go into the descriptions, especially if it's a fairly simple table. A more complex table, you might want to tell people more about what the table is providing them. But this is kind of an optimization, I would say, versus something that's critical and important to do, like the repeating header rows. As I mentioned, charts are kind of challenging. Something like this, an automatically generated one, a user can kind of read this, but it's going to be hard because it's going to read like this axis first of the chart, the y-axis. It'll read the x-axis then afterwards. Then it might read individual data for category 1. It might instead read, each of these in sequence, but then it's not going to read category 1, which each of these 3 columns. So the user has to remind themselves that this is still in category 1 and that they're in category 2. So it requires a lot more mental power on their end to make sure that they're keeping information in the correct order. And we don't really have a way to change that in order to say category 1 for this column and this column and this column without adding a whole lot of extra information that's going to kind of interfere with the understanding. So again, we can add alt text to charts the same way. And this is where you might provide just a quick description of what the chart explains. So we can say, maybe this is about monthly income. We might also tell users, here's another location you can get this information. Doing that would be better to put it in text below it. And it's just like as a caption saying for, a more accessible version, you can put that, you can click this link and it'll take you elsewhere. But generally, that's all we can do with charts. I see a raised hand. I will get to you after I finish the demonstration, so please hold on for a short moment, but thank you. I will try to answer that when I can. So sometimes writing out a quick summary is a great idea. So telling us what the category 1 is, what is each amount at, and then category 2, yada, yada. This can make your document longer, but it's usually a good idea to provide at least a basic summary, and it's kind of good practice in general. Now, 2-column layouts or more. We're at 1:45, so I should probably speed up a little bit. So a column, when you set it up, screen reader is going to read through the first column and then the second column. So if you're using this layout in multiple ways, just keep that in mind, is that in Microsoft Word, at least, it's going to do one whole column first and then the next. So if you're trying to make instead jump from one to the other, You might have to set up multiple 2-column layouts with maybe a single line afterwards to kind of break it up, or you might need to organize your information in a way that it reads how you intend the user to read it, even if visually you might intend for someone to kind of zigzag through it. So keep that in mind. Now, form fields kind of work the same way in that when we now in this case, we're going to double click. Oh, no, sorry. The old version does that. So you will need to add the developer tab to your menu ribbon in order to create form fields. But once you've done that, after you select what type of form field you put in, there's a properties button in the controls. We click properties. This is where you have title and tag. This is again where you need to put in the label for that form field. So you will need to put in, obviously, this has a tooltip, but you'll want to put in text above it as well, telling users what this is. I would recommend having something have a show or color just to help people differentiate your form field from regular text. Make sure that they know it's there, because in some cases, if I cancel this, if I go into this one and I click inside of it to edit it, it might disappear and not have that background anymore. So that's why I have it. So this is an older version of a text field. There's multiple versions in here. This is a legacy one. This is where instead, if you're using this, you have an older document you're editing, you're going to have to use add help text, and this is where you would add the same labels that we need. Once you've done that, kind of works the same way for checkboxes and all such. They still have it all in the same properties. Okay. Last thing I want to show you in Word is it does have a built-in accessibility checker. So if we go to File, and we go to the Info tab on the left here, the second button is Inspect Document. If we click that button, the second option, so there'll be a drop-down that appears. The first option is Inspect Document. The second one is Check Accessibility. You can click that, and it runs an accessibility checker here on the right. And it looks like they just updated it again. This used to just have like a list of issues. Now it looks like they've broken it out into multiple areas, which is great. It gives us more information, so that's very helpful. But this is a little bit new to us. But in this case, it checks now for color contrast. It tells us, hey, your image doesn't have alt text. I would tell you it's also going to tell us if the table doesn't, so just keep that in mind. That might fail and such here. But this is a great starting tool for making sure you're doing the basics. Just because you've cleared everything on here doesn't mean your document is fully accessible, because things like reading structure and how you intend users to read it and link descriptions and such, it can't assess that because those are kind of subjective judgments, like the quality of your alt text. But this does let you know, hey, you did not add alt text to this thing, or hey, we're missing headings, or hey, our table doesn't have headers, or we're using merged cells. So it's a great way to kind of take care of those basic problems so that you are getting off on the right foot. So I recommend after you make a document, before you send it out to the public or to another office or something, you run it through the accessibility checker, fix those issues that appear. It will tell you what is the issue here and how to fix it. So it gives you a lot of tools to help fix the problem. Okay, before I get into PowerPoint, let's go ahead and try and answer that question. So if I open this, okay. Okay, you should be able to talk if you would like. Or you can just put your question in chat if you have it. Oh, I see it here. Never mind. Will we be able to watch this presentation later on in the day? Yes, it is being recorded, and we will post the recording to our YouTube channel in a day or two.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay. Now, let us cover PowerPoint. So let me close this. There we go. And then I'm just going to use the presentation that we were using today. So in PowerPoint, um, things like headings and document structure are handled by the template. So whenever you set up that initial document, you won't be um, creating kind of the same things. You don't have that styles menu and such. So when you create a slide layout, uh, wherever it has that title or whatever, that acts as your heading. So you don't have to worry about that. But if you don't have that, so if you create like a blank slide and just put information in there or something, the accessibility checker might yell at you that, hey, this slide doesn't have a title. So be aware of that fact and be sparing with how you use that. Um, things like color and contrast and such are kind of going to have to manually handle. I will warn you sometimes some of these designs that are your default aren't the greatest for that. So like this default one, that text is a little light, which is why I've darkened it on my version. So just be aware of that. You might need to play with colors with some of these defaults, but a lot of them are pretty good. Um, I have run into an issue before to make you all aware of if you convert this to PDF for whatever reason, because sometimes convention organizers will ask for that in order to share it. Uh, if your titles have some kind of effect on them, when it converts to a PDF, the PDF might not read it correctly, and it might instead treat that as an object and screw it up to read as text. So you might have to go back and reformat a few things. Um, However, for the most part, your template kind of takes care of a lot of those basics for you. So on our home page, or home ribbon, apologies, as I mentioned before, in your drawing group, after your paragraph styles, the second button is arrange. And then the last option in the drop down is selection pane. And that is what determines our reading order. If you have 365, you actually have an accessibility tab now. And this is where you have the reading order pane. Um, kind of the same thing, but that's also there. I would recommend using the reading order pane because this is also makes it a little bit easier because it lists out everything and what it's reading as to users. Uh, it also has the ability to uncheck something and make it decorative in here. So we don't have to like bounce between like alt text or mark as decorative. We can kind of do that as we're doing our reading order. So basic slides like this that are using the template are going to read in the correct order. But if for whatever reason, oops, if I don't have a slide on here that's more than just text, unfortunately. But if for whatever reason, in this case, like I added our logo here for lack of a better example, uh, it will appear in the reading order as you add objects. So you might need to, if I move this above our title here, I might want users to read this first so that they know this is an empty tab presentation, and I can move that up in the reading order so that it reads first. Or I can make it decorative so that a user skips it if it's not adding any information. So if I added this logo to all of our slides, I would probably want it to be read on the first slide so that a user understands this is our presentation. But then to reduce clutter on the other slides, I probably make it decorative in all of them, all the rest, so that they don't have to hear our logo on every single slide as they're reading through. So that's how we handle our reading order. Again, this is also in this accessibility menu. Uh, You have the alt text button right after reading order, but if we go to picture format, we have that same button here. If you're in older versions, it's also again in the context menu, so you can always right click it and open that and do the same thing we did in Word, where you have the alt text, generate alt text, or mark as decorative. So a lot of the options are the same in other programs. Excel has a lot of these features. I don't go into detail in Excel in this presentation either, but I'm happy to do one if people would find that useful. If you're using Publisher, I haven't touched Publisher in some time, but Publisher generally has some of these options, but it's going to be a bit more complex because that is more of a layout program intended for things like flyers and such. So I cover that more in our graphic design webinar than I do here. One last thing before we get to any other questions, and I should have shown you this earlier, is if, I'm going to go back to Word for this, but you can do this with PowerPoint or whatever, is if you're intending to save this as a PDF, so let me first save the document. If I go to File, since I have Adobe as a plugin, I have an option here, Save as Adobe PDF, but you're probably just going to use Save As. I can click Save As. I can go to more options or browse or whatever, and go to Desktop. And this is where I can save as a type. I'm going to select PDF here. And then I want to go to this Options button that comes up after the description of the file. In Options, down near the bottom here, there is a document structure tags for accessibility. We want to make sure that we click that. We also want to make sure that we maintain the document properly, so we want to make sure that that's checked. And then if you're making a longer document, you might want to create bookmarks as well, and you want to use the headings for that. So by clicking these options, all of the work we do in Word to, create headings and create alt text and all of that, by having this option here, all of that converts to PDF. You don't have to do any extra work in PDF other than double check your reading order. Because it can potentially add tags to extra things, like if you press enter or create space between lines, it might assign a tag there. You might have to go in and delete that, but a lot of that is just cleaning up rather than having to do all of your work again. So make sure that this option is checked to save yourself a lot of time and headache. Once you've clicked it the first time, it generally should stay there. But it's always good to go back and double check things. Okay. Uh, with that, let me bring up my menu again. Let's look at chat. If you have any further questions, please feel free to put them in chat here. I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. If you need to, you can contact us directly. So our group email for our program is mdod.nva@maryland.gov. You can email us there, either myself or our specialist, Dan. We will be happy to answer your questions as we can. If you are a state employee and you want some additional help or review of your document, you can submit a service desk ticket, assign it to the IT accessibility group, and we can take a look at it for you. As I mentioned, you can go to our YouTube channel. The username is mdtapvideo. Again, I will provide that link to you guys in the email with the recording, and you can go back and look at some of our older webinars that I've mentioned. Then we have a link to our quick cards that help give you some kind of tips and basic reminders for all these individual programs to help you keep in mind to do things like add alt text and add headings. Finally, there is a link in the presentation that you guys will get to the section 508.gov content creation section. Also has a lot of helpful information about this if you need. Okay. Let me open Q&A quick just to make sure I'm not missing something. Okay, I am not seeing any other questions. So I will give it another minute or so, but I'm going to stop the recording here.